This is not a piece about awareness. It's about what happens when observation replaces authority and neutrality is mistaken for safety. If you've ever felt like you are present in your own life but not fully inside it, if you've learned how to see everything clearly while remaining strangely unchanged, if you've delayed movement, not because you were afraid, but because you were being responsible, being careful, or waiting until you understood more. This is not here to activate you. A menta does not need obedience. It needs supervision. It needs beings who watch themselves instead of choosing, who manage instead of move. What follows is not a lesson. It is not a call to action. It is not an invitation to improve yourself. It is recognition. And sometimes recognition is enough to make the position you're standing in impossible to maintain. There is a particular feeling that doesn't announce itself as a problem. It doesn't look like crisis or dysfunction. It feels more like standing just behind yourself, watching your own life happen with a degree of composure that others might even admire. You are present but slightly offset, engaged but not fully inside. You register what's happening, you notice patterns, you understand dynamics, and yet something about participation feels delayed. It's not numbness. It's not fear exactly. It's a quiet positioning just outside the moment, as if your life is something you're meant to observe carefully rather than enter directly. Many people mistake this distance for clarity. They think they are being measured, aware, even evolved. But what often goes unnamed is the subtle ache of living one step removed from your own pulse. This distance carries a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the tiredness that comes from doing too much, but the fatigue of constantly keeping watch. There is effort involved in monitoring yourself, tracking your reactions, assessing whether something is appropriate, deciding if now is the right time, the right mood, the right version of you. Even rest becomes supervised. Expression is filtered. Desire is reviewed. You may feel worn down without being able to point to anything you've actually done to deserve that fatigue. Nothing overtly terrible is happening, and yet something is always being managed. The energy cost doesn't come from action, but from restraint. From the ongoing labor of staying neutral, reasonable, composed. This kind of tiredness is hard to justify to others, even harder to explain to yourself, because on the surface, everything looks fine. If you listen closely, there is often a presence behind this distance. Not a loud voice, not a critic, but something that oversees. It watches your thoughts, your impulses, your tone. It notices when you're about to act and quietly checks in. Is this necessary? Is this wise? Is this too much? It doesn't forbid, it moderates. It doesn't interrupt with drama. It hovers with caution. This presence feels like an internal supervisor. Not hostile, not cruel, but constantly attentive. It's the part of you that steps in between impulse and movement, experience and expression. You might not experience it as control at all. It feels more like guidance, like someone responsible is on duty. And because it doesn't shout, it's easy to believe it exists for your benefit. What makes this presence difficult to question is how reasonable it feels. It presents itself as maturity, as discernment, as ethics. It frames itself as the part of you that has learned from experience, that knows better than to rush, that understands consequences. Compared to chaos or recklessness, it feels clean. Compared to impulsivity, it feels safe. Many people take pride in this internal regulation. They see it as evidence of growth, proof that they are no longer reactive, no longer naive. And in a world that rewards composure and punishes intensity, this internal supervisor often appears to be the most socially acceptable part of you. It helps you avoid mistakes. It helps you avoid embarrassment. It helps you avoid being wrong. At least, that's how it introduces itself. But over time, something subtle happens. Decisions don't disappear, they defer. Action doesn't become impossible, it becomes postponed. You may feel informed but unmoved, clear but strangely inactive. Life is understood in great detail, yet rarely entered without qualification. You wait for certainty. You wait for the right alignment. You wait until you feel fully justified. And because the supervisor never says no, it's hard to argue with. It just keeps saying, not yet. So you stay adjacent. You analyze situations you could be inside of. You reflect on feelings you could be living through. You become very good at explaining why something hasn't happened, and less practiced at letting things actually occur. At a certain point, it helps to name what this really is. This is not intuition. It is not wisdom. It is not consciousness observing itself. It is internal hierarchy. It is supervision turned inward. A governing structure that does not command overtly, but oversees continuously. Hierarchy does not always arrive as a ruler barking orders. Sometimes it arrives as a watcher who never leaves their post. A presence that monitors rather than directs, that evaluates rather than forbids. It does not take authority through force, it takes it by default, by staying in place while nothing else is allowed to decide. And because it feels calm, measured, and ethical, it rarely gets recognized as a form of rule at all. This form of hierarchy is especially effective because it stays invisible. It doesn't punish disobedience, it withholds permission. It doesn't impose consequences, it delays them indefinitely. It frames restraint as virtue and hesitation as intelligence. When action doesn't occur, it offers reasons instead of prohibitions. It tells you that you're being careful, that you're being responsible, that you're honoring complexity. In this way, obedience doesn't feel like obedience. It feels like self-control. And because nothing dramatic happens when you defer, there's no obvious moment to revolt against. The system doesn't need to block you when it can convince you to stand still on your own. One of the most disorienting aspects of this structure is that it often feels good, clean, elevated, above messiness, above reaction, above consequence. The watcher carries a subtle moral posture, a sense of being the bigger person, of not being governed by impulse, of staying neutral while others react. This moral framing is what makes it so difficult to question, because to act decisively can feel crude by comparison. To choose can feel aggressive. To move without full understanding can feel irresponsible. Over time, neutrality itself becomes a value, even when it costs you aliveness. And because the watcher rarely causes immediate harm, its long-term effects are easy to overlook. What this structure quietly produces, however, is a particular kind of loneliness. Being watched is not the same as being supported. Being supervised is not the same as being guided. The internal supervisor does not comfort, does not reassure, does not accompany. It only regulates. It keeps order. It maintains distance. And so even in moments where you appear composed, there can be a deep sense of being alone with your experience, as if no one is actually inside it with you, not even yourself. This loneliness doesn't come from lack of connection with others. It comes from being governed rather than inhabited, from living under observation rather than within authority. At some point, a question begins to surface, even if it isn't fully formed yet. What if the thing that has been keeping you safe is also the thing preventing authority from returning to your body? What if awareness, instead of being a gateway, became a substitute for permission? What if observation is not neutral at all, but a form of internal rule that has simply learned to wear the mask of wisdom? This file does not exist to make you more conscious. It exists to end internal supervision. And once you see that distinction clearly, the position you've been standing in may no longer feel as harmless as it once did. If something in you shifted while listening, not because you understand more, but because you felt accurately named, let that register. You are not passive for refusing to move under supervision. You are not immature for hesitating inside systems that reward neutrality over consequence. And you are not broken for feeling exhausted by a life spent watching instead of entering. Some forms of awareness are not freedom. They are containment wearing the language of wisdom. If this transmission named something you've been carrying without language, there is a fuller kill file that goes further, not to make you more conscious, but to terminate the internal verdict that told you observation was the highest form of safety. It exists as a weapon, not a reassurance. For now, just take this with you. If authority never reached your body, it was never because you lacked clarity. Let that be enough for now.